Hello, my name is Taylor. I am from Garden Valley, Idaho. That was where I was raised and have spent much of my life. I stumbled across an excellent book today called Along the River by Nellie Ireton Mills about the territorial and pioneer days on the Payette River, and there is an incredible chapter about Garden Valley that I would like to share with you. The Upper Payette and Garden Valley, ringed about by high mountains, jagged peaks, and tall timber, Garden Valley during the settlement days and for many years thereafter was above and beyond the other river communities, with no direct communication whatsoever. Strung along the middle and south forks of the Payette, just above their confluence, the righteous scenery of the valley is no more challenging and exciting than some of the tales of romance and adventure that have come from that section. Many have been lost, but the fogs of almost 100 years have not been able to obliterate all of them. Rather than coming up the river in the normal way, the first travelers and even the settlers almost literally dropped into the valley's green meadows from the hills above. Only 10 or 12 miles away, over a high ridge to the southeast, the ill-fated Grimes and his party made that first discovery of Boise Basin gold in 1862. From the spot where his companions buried their fallen leader, on the pass that bears his name, one can look across the canyons and treetops and see Garden Valley far below, resting like an emerald in a setting of darker green. The old Indian or Packer John Trail led this way from the North Idaho mining camps of Florence, Orofino, and Pierce City. But in the confusion and excitement of the gold rush, no attention was paid to records, so it is difficult to determine who was the first to come through the valley or to take up land. At Florence, others besides Grimes had heard tales of the shining sand in the mountain basin far to the south. Thomas Scallon, later a well-known Garden Valley rancher, and his brothers Pat and Mike were members of one of the first prospecting parties to come down from the north. They were in the basin when Grimes was killed. Others, who passed this way in 1862 and later returned to become Garden Valley residents, included Harry Carter and Patrick Lennon. A few bachelors took squatters' claims that first year, most of them later selling to men with families, the first of whom was Charles Ostner, famous in Idaho history for his artistic ability. After a tragic trip down from Florence in the spring of 1863, Ostner brought an interest in the stopping place and land of Mr. Thomas, located on the South Fork where the Packer John Trail crossed the river. Leaving his family in San Francisco, Ostner had joined the gold rush to the mines of the Clearwater and Salmon River sections of northeastern Idaho in 1862. Then came news of the sensational strikes in Boise Basin, and early in the spring of 1863, he and a companion with one pack donkey started for the new diggings. Charles L. Ostner was born in Germany in 1828, where he received an excellent education in the arts and science before coming to America at 18 years of age. He traveled extensively in other states, but made home in California, and there married Miss Julia Armbruster, who also had been born in Germany and come to the United States when only 20. She remained in the German colony of San Francisco with relatives when her husband followed the gold trail to Idaho. Coming down the winding mountain trail from Florence to the junction of the Main and Little Salmon Rivers, the artist soul of Charles Ostner must have thrilled at the marvelous panorama of mountains, canyons, and rivers visible at every turn in the trail. Packer John blazed the trail this way for many excited miners. Plodding along after a donkey was hard work, and Ostner's companion was not too agreeable, evidently feeling that others could have the gold if only by some means, fair or foul, he could get back to San Francisco. someplace on the trip, possibly on the ridge between Round Valley and the South Fork of the Payette, and probably by the other's intent, the two men became separated. For 40 days, Charles Ostner wandered back and forth over the ridge and down the steep canyons, searching for his companion and food. The other man, breaking all codes of the hills, took the donkey and their small store of food and made his way out to civilization. Finally, Packer John Welch, friend of hill travelers, found Ostner emaciated and unconscious near the present hardscrabble above Garden Valley. One might wonder if Mr. Ostner's experience gave the locality its name, and managed to take him to the bachelor home of one Thompson at the trail crossing on the South Fork. Carefully, the weakened, dazed man was nursed back to a semblance of his former self, although he never was really well again. Early in 1864, Charles Ostner brought an interest in Thompson's Toil Pack Bridge and stopping place at this point, and sent to San Francisco for his wife and 4 children. They were still in the German colony in San Francisco, where his wife's family had moved from New Orleans to avoid being involved in the Civil War. They left Germany to get away from war. The trip to Idaho was tedious and fraught with danger, but seemed comparatively safe to Mrs. Ostner, who remembered crossing the Isthmus of Panama when there was no regular transportation. Then many threats were necessary to keep the native oarsmen from rowing up the streams where they could plunder and kill their passengers. As much shocked as frightened, the staid German mothers were kept busy admonishing their children to look at the sky and not at the marked oarsmen. Mr. Ostner's business must have been both interesting and profitable, to judge from the following ad in the Idaho World of November 16th, 1867. Ho for Deadwood! Direct and best route from Boise Basin to the new diggings is by the old Placerville Trail to Ostner's Bridge over to Payette. The bridge has been recently constructed in a substantial manner and is now open to accommodate the traveling public. The old Placerville Trail free. Distance from Placerville to Bridge 12 miles, Bridge to Deadwood. The trip from California to Idaho for the little family was made by ocean steamer to Portland, river steamer to Wallulu on the Columbia, dead axle wagon until the road ran out, and then pack train to Placerville, where Mr. Ostner met them. His physical condition, the result of his harrowing experience while lost, was a decided shock to Mrs. Ostner. As soon as possible, Ostner, who was always drawing, painting, or carving, his great talent could not be put aside, cut a large pine tree across Alder Creek from his residence to secure material for a carving of George Washington and Charger. Much of the work was done at night after a hard day on the farm. His only light a flickering tallow candle held by his 8-year-old son, Albert Al Ostner, or by one or the other of his 2 little daughters. Mr. Ostner, artist that he was, found the grueling work on the farm very trying, but he was more than thankful for the blessings of a free country and was determined to realize his dream of creating a mounted statue of Washington, the father of his new country. Life was strenuous at times. All but exhausted by his ranch and family duties, he still continued to work on the statue, copying Washington's features from a postage stamp. Mrs. Ostner also had many trying experiences. Once a man who knew nothing about a boat started to row across the river with her 3 children. Somehow, in the middle of the stream, he tipped the boat and fell out with the oars. He got to shore, but the swift current carried the boat and children rapidly down the river. The frantic mother ran screaming along the bank until heard by her husband and a hired working man in the fields who were able to rescue the children. The mother, who was also frightened when, after the first election, a very hotly disputed contest, a neighbor who had been imbibing too much forced his way into the house and demanded the election's returns that Ostner had charge of, insisting that they were fraudulent. Because the only, and I'm changing this word, African American in the community had voted. This was in 1866, not long after the Civil War, and freedom for slaves was a burning issue. Mr. Ostner explained that the African American was a free man and had a right to vote, and that he would not give up the returns. Finally, he was obligated to put the disturbing neighbor out of his house. The poor African American man, nearly frightened to death, hid in the Sinig's barn until feelings cooled down.
Distance: bridge to Salmon Basin 90 miles, to Fort Lemhi 160, to Lewiston 190. Charles Ostner, September 11th, 1867, proper Payette Bridge. The Ostners had only a pack bridge, but there was more trail traffic through the hills at the time. About 60 persons wintered in Deadwood that winter in 1867, as reported by John S. Gray, a well-known pioneer attorney of Boise, who came out from the camp in the fall and expected to return the following spring. About this time, the first schoolhouse, a one-room log cabin, was built as a community project, actual construction being done by Mr. Ostner and his neighbor. It stood on the knoll where Garden Valley High School building now stands. David Hanna was the first teacher, and a very good one, it is said, but later the unfortunate man that died in a shooting scrape in Placerville. The first school session had, however, been held in the Abbott home before the schoolhouse was built, with Miss Julia McAuliffe, later Mrs. John Gardner of Emmett, as teacher. Mr. Ostner soon brought his partner's interest in the place on the river, the latter saying, "I like you fine, like your family, and the business is good, but I want to be where there are more people." So he departed for the gay city of San Francisco. After the statue of Washington was completed, Mr. Ostner exhibited it in the several Boise Basin towns and charged a small admission fee and brought it on to Boise. For years, the gilded statue of the horse and rider occupied a prominent place in the Capitol grounds. It is now in the rotunda. Years later, the state voted to pay Mr. Ostner $7,000 for what is probably the territory's most important work of art. But money was scarce, and he actually received only $2,500. In 1869, Ostner sold his ranch and business to Tom Young, and the first family of Garden Valley moved to Boise to make their home. The second family to make home in Garden Valley, the Abbotts, in 1866. Writing to the Idaho Daily Statesman in September of 1928, A.S. Abbott of Grand Pass, Oregon, told his family's life experience in where was then known as the Upper Payette Valley as follows. Among the first settlers after the hunters and trappers were my father, R. Abbott, and his brother Billy. My father filed a squatter's claim on a 1,000-acre farm in about the center of the valley, now known as the Tucker Place, and his brother took a claim on the opposite side of the South Fork of the Payette River, known as the Charter's Place. This was in the spring of 1866. In June of that year, Cal White, only a few months ago having passed to the great beyond, filed on a claim enjoying my father's adjoining my father's, afterwards becoming the Howe and McLaughlin farm, and now part of the Mills property. The same season, George Van Winkle filed a claim on the Warm Springs in the Middle Fork of the Payette, and Charlie Yank Ladd, who had previously settled in the valley as a fisherman and trapper, filed on a claim near the forks of the South and Middle Forks of the river, and that season built the first of the valley's fisheries traps in the Middle Fork, from which he marketed immense quantities of the delicious fellows of the miners and others to the basin in Placerville, Idaho City, and other towns of the Boise Basin District, and also from which the farmers of the valley stocked their ladders, but for which the big-hearted Yank not even as much as thought of charging. As a matter of fact, his neighbors were always first in Yank's heart, and what he had was theirs for the asking. Yank also did some trapping for bear, of which I shall write later on.
Bill's first wagon road. The first passageway into the valley was an old Indian trail, slightly improved by the first comers to permit importation of cargoes via mule and horseback to the miners, who by this time were finding their way into every direction of the interior parts of the territory. In the summer and fall of 1866, my father, with the help of a hired man, built the first wagon road over the mountains from Placerville and established it as a toll road. Included in this was a bridge over the South Fork, a little below where the present bridge stands. Alex Siders, handy with tools, superintended its construction, as he afterward did the construction of the flume over the river that delivered the waters of Alder Creek to my father's farm. At the fall election of 1866, my father was elected to represent Boise County in the legislature that was to meet in Boise in January of the coming year. That session succeeded in passing through that body and the statute books a measure enabling the country to take over the toll road, and in due time the road became a county public thoroughfare. Patty and the Bear. Pat Glennon and George Van Winkle married sisters, the Van Winkle wedding preceding that of Pat's by considerable time. It must be stated also that the ranch partner of Mr. Glennon was Patty Clifton, a native son of the old sod, and in every way a worthy partner and a worthy man. And here I hope the reader will pardon me if I sidestep from my historical narrative to tell a little story about Patty and the Bear. Patty was working, making hay in a field nearby one day, when all of a sudden he heard terrific commotion coming from the direction of the hog pens. Hurriedly hiding himself away to learn the cause, found within the enclosure a good-sized black bear helping himself rather unceremoniously to a free meal of fresh pork. Patty waited not on ceremonies, but forthwith attacked the intruder with a pitchfork, and in short order, Mr. Bruin had paid with his life the price of Patty's pig. First schoolhouse. The first schoolhouse built in the valley was of hewn logs on the hillside near the Abbott home, in a place commanding a beautiful view of a good part of the valley. However, the first school was conducted in one room of my father's house where the new school was built, with Julian McAuliffe the first teacher. The first public hall erected in the valley was built by Messrs. Howe and McLaughlin, adjoining their farmhouse. These gentlemen also laid out constructed the first racetrack, a mile circular run Though racing had for some time been a regular sporting event in the Valley Fork, always attended by the Bloods from the Basin, from Boise to the Boise Valley country. Indeed, sometimes racers came from as far away as Grand Round Country in Oregon. There are many yet who will remember that noted horse racer and all-around gambler Hank Vaughn, who frequently visited the valley at horse racing time, and not infrequently walked away with the quote-unquote goods. Historic tree. It was the writer's privilege to look upon the tree out of which Charles Oster carved the George Washington Monument, just after it had been felled, before the bark had been removed, and many times during the execution of that splendid work, watched the master as he carved out various parts of the whole. During the Indian uprisings of 77 and 78, the people of the valley did not become overly excited about the matter, though at various times during the later year, fire flare signals were frequently seen coming from the summits of the high mountains on either side of the valley, from one to the other in quick succession, indicating that I'm changing this word, Native Americans were signaling to one another. The only depredation committed seemed to be by a renegade band of 5 or 6 who at night crept up and stole 4 head of horses belonging to Charlie Yank Ladd, one a fine $400 stallion, which were tied to racks and feeding within 30 to 40 feet of sleeping and probably snoring threshers. Not a sound was heard by anyone during the perpetration of the deed. Discovered in the early morning, a posse was organized with Tom Cooper, an old hunter and trapper who had seen much of life among the Native Americans, as captain. At about 10 in the morning, they took up the trail, which led in the direction of Deadwood Basin, but after following 2 days, retracted steps homeward, as from all indications, the Native Americans were fast gaining ground and making for them almost inaccessible fastness of the wild interior mountains, and the chase seemed hopeless. It is interesting to me, however, that but for the positive command of our captain that we camped to the first night out, just before entering a forest, it is not at all likely that a single one of the white braves would ever have returned home alive. At daybreak the following morning, the trail was taken up that led through the forest. Within a mile from where our camp was made, we came upon the Native Americans' camp on the top of the rocky precipice on one side of the trail, with a huge boulder facing entrance between the two. The marks of the sentinel of the Reds was found from where we watched throughout the night hours, and behind which the others of his band slept in peace. An ambuscade from which probably not a single soul could have escaped. Not long after the Ostners went to Boise, the old place by the South Fork Bridge was sold by Tom Young to Nicholas Wetzel. Mr. Wetzel was a butcher who had followed his trade in the mining towns of the basin before coming to the valley. He was born in Germany. A few years after they moved here with his wife, his wife died, and in 1882 he married Mrs. Mary Zapp, a widow with 3 sons, Matthias, Peter, and George. The second Mr. Wetzel came to the United States from Germany with her parents in 1851 and settled in Brooklyn, New York. There she married Nathaniel Zapp, a Frenchman who brought his wife to Idaho City, Idaho. Mr. Zapp died in Centerville, and it was 3 years later that his widow married Mr. Wetzel. To them were born 2 sons, John and Thomas. The latter married a daughter of William Charters. The place by the river bridge was a busy one, but Mrs. Wetzel was a wonderful housekeeper, self-reliant, patient, and industrious. She proved herself always a true friend and neighbor. She died in Boise in 1917. Her youngest son, Tom Wetzel, lived for many years on the old Garden Valley Ranch. He and his wife had no children of their own, but a number of nieces and nephews called their house home. Active in school and community affairs, they did much for the young people. Were she living, Grandmother Wetzel would be proud of a grandson, Carl Zapp, a vice president of the Morrison Knutson Company, and others in and around Boise. John Sittig and his wife Joanna moved to Garden Valley in 1867 and brought a squatter's right from Billy Abbott on the place just west of the Ostners, now known as the Old Charters Ranch. Both were born in Germany and had come to New York aged respectively 17 and 13, but did not know each other at the time. Mr. Sitting was a 49er in California, but went east again and engaged in wholesale shoe business in LeClaire, Iowa. His first wife was burned to death there and left one son, Isaac Sitting. On a buying trip from New York City, Mr. Sitting met Joanna Fox, and after only 2 weeks of acquaintance, took her to Iowa to be his bride. In 1867 or 68, he came west along with his family to Placerville, Idaho, driving an ox and a milk cow to Prairie Schooner. Indians were plentiful on the plains and would sometimes follow the immigrants for days, begging for firewater. In 1872, Mr. Sitting sold his ranch to Mr. Bales and went to California, where he engaged in the confectionery business in San Francisco, but lost all of his money in a bank failure. In 1882, he again came to Idaho and settled on his old place, but later moved to the Warm Springs Ranch, where he lived for many years. To them were born 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. The elder daughter, Amelia, Mrs. John Gardner, lived almost her entire life on the Little Warm Springs Ranch. The younger daughter, Caroline, Mrs. James Fisher, later of Twin Falls, spoke lovingly of her mother's wonderful disposition. She said, "City-born and bred she was. Mother readily took up all the duties of ranch life without a murmur and was always happy and contented. Putting her in a cabin, and soon she would make a palace. Put her in a cabin, and soon she'd make a palace out of it." Mr. Sitting was a clever and capable man who had seen much of life and could do anything. Flowers, fruit trees, and a wonderful garden made up of their second Garden Valley home at the Hot Springs, not far from the Middle Fork, a most charming spot. One granddaughter of this esteemed couple, Genevieve Gardner, is now a resident of Boise. Thomas Skellion, who we will remember had come to southern Idaho from the Florence mines as early as the ill-fated Grimes party, decided he had better return to his wife in San Francisco and hoped to come back when the conditions in Idaho were more favorable. There were many Indian scares in 1862. Born in Cork, Ireland in 1830, Scannion, with many other young Irishmen, arrived in San Francisco in the gold rush days. There he married Julia Hayes, a native of Belfast, Ireland, born in 1844. The bridesmaid at his wedding, later Mrs. Carrington, also became a resident of Garden Valley. Early in 1863, Scanlon, convinced that there was gold in Idaho hills, determined to return to the Boise Basin and bring his wife with him. They came first to Idaho City, then to Pioneer, and on to Granite Creek. In describing that overland trip, Mrs. Scanlon told how her husband carried her across the creeks and carefully cared for her on the long trail. In a few years, they decided to try farming and settled first on what is known as the Charters Place in Garden Valley. Later, he was in a partnership with Patrick Glennon on the old Patrick Glennon, on the old Glennon place and finally settled on the middle fork of the ranch now owned by Mrs. Bert Graham. With a house full of children, 3 sons and 4 daughters, Mrs. Scanlon's life was a busy one, but much native Irish wit and good nature made the home a happy one. Mrs. Scallion always was ready to go to others in distress. In this particular, their eldest daughter, Mary, Mrs. Frank Castle, was very like her mother. There was not a more kindly person than Mary Castle in all of the hill country. 2 of the Scanlon daughters are living still. Mrs. B.K. Emma Prestel of Boise, the youngest. Mrs. Catherine Bell lives in Washington, D.C. John Scanlon, the oldest son, a pioneer of the Thunder Mountain country, now resides in Boise with his only daughter, Mrs. Clarence Thompson, on Denver Street. A number of other descendants of the early Scanlon pioneers live in and around Boise. Patrick Glennon, who, as you will remember, came through the valley at the time of the gold discovery in the basin, returned and made his home on the south bank of the Middle Fork. He was born in Athlone, Ireland in 1832 and went to the California miners by the way of the Isthmus of Panama. He often told his sons of walking much of the way across the isthmus, of almost choking for a drink. Perhaps this is the reason Pat Glennon never walked again nor missed a drink. Always he rode the best of horses and liked to race better than anything in the world, except his wife and children. His horse partner deserves a place in the annals of Garden Valley. In June of 1872, at the Carrington Ranch, Patrick Glennon married Mary Naylor, born in Boone Country, Missouri, in 1842. To them were born 3 sons and 3 daughters. Their youngest son, John, lived for many years on the old home place. It now belongs to his widow. Pat Glennon's ready wit and love for fun was the delight of all, and many are the interesting stories told about him. He adored his he adored his wife and his children, and often said, "A man needs but one partner, and that a long-haired one." Mrs. Glennon was never happier than when entertaining all the boys and girls of the neighborhood in her attractively furnished ranch home. The long table filled with children enjoying a good dinner, upon whom she constantly urged more of the delicious food, was one of the delights of her life. A number of Glennon grandchildren are residents of southern Idaho. A sturdy Scotch family that settled in the Garden Valley at the early date was that of Donald McBride. He was born in Glasgow in 1829, and as a lad went to the sea in a whaling vessel and eventually rounded the Horn, and finally anchored in the harbor of Vancouver, BC. There he left the ship. He often told about the trip of his having seen what the sailors termed the Flying Dutchman as he rounded the Horn. Some strange phenomenon caused by the moon's reflection seemed to make a phantom ship appear that the sailors, in their fright, often thought was a pirate ship. Mr. McBride went to the Fraser River in the Caribou country in Canada during the gold excitement there, and as far north as the Mackenzie River. Margaret MacDonald was born in Edinburgh in 1836. She came west to Vancouver by the way of Isthmus and Panama as a nurse with a family by the name of Yates. In Vancouver, she met and married Donald McBride. They kept the Victoria Hotel in Vancouver for a time, and in 1865 or 66 came to Idaho with an ox team with Ed Malloy and his family. They were in Boise a short time and then went to Buena Vista Bar, Idaho City, where they kept the Caribou House, the name doubtless suggested by Mr. McBride's experience in the Caribou country. in 67 or 68. They moved to Garden Valley with the saddle and pack horses, and Mrs. McBride carried her eldest son, Danny, then but a babe in arms, on the horse with her. They first settled in the Warm Springs, but soon moved a little further down the valley to establish their permanent home. To them were born 7 children, 2 daughters, the late Mrs. Frank Dunlap and Mrs. James DuChambeau, Sr. of Boise, were like their mother, wonderful, helpful pioneer women. An older son, John McBride, an honest, upright man, lived on the old homestead many years before moving to Boise, where he died. The youngest son, Archie, died near Nampa in 1961. Mr. and Mrs. McBride kept a diary for years, which represents a colorful story of the early life of the valley, and many are the interesting tales told by this pioneer family. The father was a capable, serious man, and the mother a brave, sympathetic, helpful woman. The day was never too stormy, nor the night too cold and dark, for her to go to those in trouble or to help bring a baby into the world. She nursed and cared for the sick and did a man's work as well as a woman's when necessity demanded. This wonderful pioneer mother passed away in Eagle at the home of her daughter, Elsie, Mrs. DuChambeau, when she was very old. The numerous and well-known DuChambeau family of Boise, Eagle, and other valley towns are descendants. Harry Carter, the bachelor brother of Mrs. Elza Yoren, is generally credited with bringing the first wagon into Garden Valley before the road was built. He came from Placerville along the trails and over the mountains and wound deep Wash Creek over what would now seem impassable places until he reached the river. A great feat for that time, but transportation seems to have been Harry Carter's forte. When Deadwood miners were out of meat, Carter, in the dead of winter, took 3 or 4 beef steers to the high camp, giving them a ride on the crust of the snow, sliding them down the hills, enthroned in frozen cowhides. Where did this daring man from Cornwall, England, learn all the tricks of the hills? The only answer is that he had followed various mining camps in the West before coming to Garden Valley to farm, and learned many things. Carter came in 1868, following the next year by his sister, Mrs. Eliza Yoren, with her husband, Stephen, and 2 small children, James and Eliza. Both young parents were born in Cornwall, England, but had been in Wisconsin before they joined her brother in Idaho. Soon after little daughter Mary arrived, the first white girl born in Garden Valley. They took up land in the middle fork of the Payette near the mouth of Anderson Creek, and here their large family of 4 sons and 6 daughters was reared, only one dying in infancy. The father spent some of the later years of his life in Montana, but died in the old home where Mrs. Yoren had passed away a few years before. Horace E. Yoren cared for his parents and became the owner of their home, which is now the home of his son, Harry Yoren. The pioneer home was ever one of the most hospitable in the valley. There was ever life and mirth and gaiety there, and a stranger was always welcome to the best the home afforded. There the children were taught the lessons of industry and thrift, and many a neighbor, boy and girl, could long remember the strawberries, the biscuits, and chicken served to them so graciously by Mrs. Yoren. A few grandchildren live in southern Idaho, but the sons and daughters have all gone to their reward. O.S. Moore. In 1869, Owen Smith Moore brought a squatter's right from Donald McBride and moved from Idaho City to a place at the mouth of Warm Springs Creek in Garden Valley. Born in Essex County, New York, August 12, 1839, Moore could trace his lineage to the pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower. When very young, he moved with his parents to Ohio, where he grew to manhood. In the spring of 1861, accompanied by his brother and 7 others, He started for the gold fields of California, where they arrived that fall in time to vote for Abraham Lincoln for president. The trip was made by ox teams. There was much trouble with the Native Americans on the plains that year. The people behind and in front of them were killed, but they suffered only the loss of a few horses. He mined in and around Red Bluffs, California, until he heard of the gold excitement in Idaho. He and several others brought a drove of cattle from California to Idaho and arrived in Idaho City in the fall of 1864. He mined there and in 1866 was married to Mary Ann Nayland, a native of Limerick, Ireland, born in 1840. Mrs. Moore came to New York when very young, where she grew to womanhood. Then she and 6 other girls made the trip to California, called by the lure of gold and hope of a home in the West. There was much sickness in the Isthmus that year, so the trip was made around the Horn. She remained a year in San Francisco with some cousins and came to Idaho in 1865, again lured by the gold excitement. 3 children were born to the Moores, the only son dying in infancy. Their daughter Adeline, Mrs. Rodmek, who still resides on the home place with her son Ira, tells of the many frights of the family had during the Indian trouble and how they slept night after night hidden in the brush along the creek. The Moores cleared their home out of this wilderness and there lived a quiet Christian life. O.S. Moore never forgot his early training and was ever devoted to the cause of his church and to his home and family. He died on May 6, 1919. His wife, an invalid for many years, had gone before in 1896. Their eldest daughter, Sarah Jane, married Henry Clark, a native of Indiana. They lived on the Eastleigh place adjoining Road Max, which Mr. Moore gave to his daughter. Misfortune, much illness, and bad luck dogged the steps of the Clarks. Finally, the ranch was sold and another taken further up the river. 5 children were born to them, but tragedy took its toll. Their 4-year-old son disappeared, and it was supposed he fell off the bridge into the river. And a few years later, another son, Walter, was fishing alone on the South Fork and fell into the river from a high, narrow trail and drowned. Although they were not sure of his fate until his body was found several days later. The grieving mother did not long survive this shock. Mr. Clark passed away many years ago. Mrs. George Kreisenbeck, their daughter, lives in Boise, and the sons, Glendon and Alvin Clark, reside in Melba and Emmett, respectively. Fortunately, the path for the Road Max was more pleasant. They celebrated their golden wedding a couple years before he passed away in 1954. With their daughter, Mary Eden, their 3 sons and grandchildren present for the occasion. The youngest son, Ira, is principal of Garden Valley High School. Carpentiers, 1870. Nazare Carpentier, a French-Canadian, was born in Canada in 1842 and came to Oregon on the Northwest as an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1860. There he met and married in Oregon City, 1864, Mrs. Margaret Flett Dulia, a widow with 2 sons and a daughter. Her late husband had owned and operated saw and mist grills at that place. The Carpentier's eldest son, Nazare Jr., was born in Eugene, Oregon, October 16th, 1865. Mr. Carpenter first came to Idaho and the Basin Country in the spring of 1867. Returning to Oregon that fall in 1870, he again came to Idaho and brought his family with him. He located a claim and mined on Alder Creek between Placerville and Garden Valley that summer, and the next year filed on 160 acres of land on the South Fork of the Payette. About 4 miles above Garden Valley, there a permanent home was established, and their family and 4 sons and 3 daughters was reared, in addition to Mrs. Carpenter's family of 3. The Carpentiers were more than hospitable. Guests came and stayed for days. Especially was this true at New Year's time each year, when a great celebration was held, with their friends coming from far and near. Mr. Carpentier had a Frenchman's love of life, and Gately was most gracious to all. Quiet and sweet and capable, Mrs. Carpentier was the ideal wife and mother. She cared for the sick, set broken limbs most skillfully, and performed all the duties of a pioneer woman. Only by trail, on foot, or horseback could the Carpentiers' home be reached for several years. The children often walked the 5 miles to the Garden Valley School. Their farm was not large, but the gravel bar near the river was rich in gold. The hills were full of game, and streams were full of fish. And up and down the river and its small tributaries, many shy, fur-bearing animals made their homes. Mr. Carpentier, trained by the Hudson's Bay Company, taught his sons all the secrets of the hills and the arts of hunting, fishing, and trapping. Theirs was a good life. A neighbor miner up the river a couple miles was Henry Hank Thompson, Idaho's beloved pioneer poet. A mile or so further up the old Scott Pack Bridge, crossed the river, and up the trail went long strings of hunters, miners, and even Chinese on their way to Deadwood and to the high mountain country beyond. The following little sketch about Lee Paw emphasizes the Carpentiers' hospitality. The tragedy of Lee Paw. Oh, ho, what is that whirling around in the eddy? It looks like the body of a man. It is. By Joel, it's that Chinese person that was drowned at Gallagher, and no mistake. His Chinese friends up at Carpentier's are offering $100 reward for him. I'll make a little cash, so said. So said Yank Ladd, farmer at the forks of the river, a queer, crafty combination of trader and kindest of neighbors. I'll tie him to the tree above that big willow, weigh him down in the cold water so he will keep. Will I go dicker with the other Chinamen? Poor Lee Paw had been crafty too, a little less greed, and his body would not have been keeping cool in the Payette. A prosperous merchant of Idaho City, Lee Paw kept a crowd of Chinese coolies reworking the pay dirt of Boise Basin, but also of Deadwood Basin. The gold left by the white miners. The coolies made some, he made much. He was the big boss. Returning from a collecting trip over the Scott Trail to Deadwood with a heavy sack of gold, Lee arrived late in the afternoon at John Gallagher's 3 miles above the site of the old Scott Bridge and asked to be put across the river. This was in about 1880. At the earliest date, there had been a pack bridge known as the Old Trail Scott Bridge, half a mile below Danskin Creek, and another near Gallagher, known as the Harrison Bridge. Evidently, both of these had gone out before Lee Paw and his gold arrived, and he asked to be put across the river. John Gallagher's raft was old, and he did not want to try the crossing, but the Chinaman, anxious to get back to the Idaho road and more gold, insisted that it be attempted at his own risk. Unhappily, Gallagher started across, but the midstream, the faulty craft became unmanageable in the swift current. It was carried away rapidly around a sharp turn and capsized. Gallagher managed to escape, but Lee Paw and his gold went to the bottom of the river. As soon as word of the tragedy reached Idaho City, quite a company of the Chinese, including some women, came to Idaho City to search the river for the merchant's body and camped at the Nazarene Carpentiers, a few miles below the scene of the accident. Here, the hospitable family, who else would have been so good, showed the unfortunate group every courtesy. The Celestials prepared their own meals outside, but were invited to spread their blankets on the living room floor in the Carpentiers' home at night while they continued their search for a number of days. There was a great event for the Carpentier children. The Chinese customs, their constant, non-understandable jabbering, and especially the smoking, intrigued the youngsters. 4 days, his friends patrolled the riverbank unsuccessfully, and a $100 reward was offered to anyone who found their lost boss's body. A few days more, and then the burly, black-whiskered, red-cheeked vegetable peddler Yank lad from 10 or 12 miles down the river, whom some of them knew, appeared at camp to claim the reward. The leaders tried desperately to make a better bargain, but Yank was adamant and refused to tell them where he was until he got the full $100. Then the sad funeral cortege, scattering little slips of rice paper with 9 holes in each along the road to confuse the devil, made its way slowly to Idaho City, where all that was mortal of the four-handed businessman was buried with full Oriental rites. Possibly the remains were at least sent to the Flowery Kingdom. He was at least well cooled off for the journey. What thrifty Yank did with his special unethical fund is not revealed. Neither is it known what became of Leapaw's sack of gold, although there have been many rumors throughout the years. When almost 90 years of age, Nez Carpentier Jr. told of the experiences. He remembered going to the Osmers with his father and watching Osner work on the George Washington statue. Inspired by the artist's work, Mr. Carpenter went home and carved a small wooden horse for each of his sons for a Christmas present. A great shock came to the family when their daughter, Mary Juliet Hunter, was killed in a snowslide at a mine not many miles from the home. Her baby daughter on her lap was not injured. The other daughters, Mrs. Carl Palm of Boise and Mrs. George Snare of Florida, and also gone now, as well as all of the sons. Nazier, the eldest, passed away in Boise in 1954, where he had been at the home of his son for some time. The mother died at the ranch and the father in Boise many years ago. Among the grandchildren are a son and daughter of George Snares is in Florida, Lexola Payne Shaw, Ed Anderson, Chester Calderwood, and Mrs. Lillian Relay, all of Boise. Well, unfortunately, there's going to have to be a part 2 because that only got us through a little more than half of the pages of the book, or the chapter, I should say, because there's other chapters about different parts of different towns along the Payette River. So, give me a follow and a like, comment below, what do you think? I know descendants of some of these people, and I apologize for some of the not politically correct verbiage. It is not my words. I'm reading this book. Trying to censor that as best I can. But anyway, I love you. I appreciate you for listening. I am very excited to learn and help you guys learn a little bit more about Garden Valley, because I grew up there and I didn't know like any of this stuff. It's all very, very interesting. Anyway, let me know what you think.